Poison has always been one of the gimmick types of Pokemon. It relies much more on mechanics than it does typing. I don't really think that this is a bad thing, and I really think that Poison should really embrace more of this. The Poison type has always had an extremely lackluster offensive ability. Up until Generation 6, it was only super effective to one type, Grass type. To counter this though, it's always had an above average defensive utility with a lot of different resistances. But Poison and Grass to me are what I would call the two status types. These are the types that rely much more on their ability to inflict status than they do outright damage. Think of it like this way. The Fire type is about doing damage, and burning comes second. In Poison type, I feel as though poisoning should really be the main focus of the type. It should be their main weapon, where Poison types are meant to slowly whittle away at their opponents without doing high amounts of damage, essentially out-surviving them rather than out-damaging them. A lot of Poison Pokemon are designed this way. They're essentially designed to sit around as long as possible and keep surviving. Look at Pokemon like Clodsire, Amoonguss, or Toxapex. I think that this is brilliant for Pokemon, as not every type has to have the insane breaking potential of a ground or an ice type. I'm a big believer in that not every type has to be equal, but every type has to have a niche. That being said, I do think that Poison could do with some buffs, and the main one of these comes down to the fact that the Poison status condition doesn't have a secondary effect. When you look at Paralysis and Burn, both of them have an extra additional effect that is really important to why they're so useful. Out of the three of these, I would say that Poison is the worst, just because it doesn't have this secondary effect that can really hamper your opponents. Paralysis, in addition for having a chance to make your opponent not move that turn, also halves their speed. Speed is probably the most important stat in the Pokemon world, so this is absolutely brilliant. You can basically stick Thunder Wave on any Pokemon and it will be helpful because it pretty much always helps to have your opponent's speed be half of what it was. For a more accurate comparison, look at Burn. Burn deals the same amount of damage as regular Poison, but it also has the added effect of halving physical attacks. The ability to basically cripple half of all Pokemon is amazing, and it's why Burn is so good. This basically makes Poison a worse version of Burn in pretty much every way, and I feel as though that needs to change. As for what secondary effect I think Poison should have, well, I'm kind of stuck between two different ones, and I'd like to know your opinions. The first is an effect that lowers special attack. This would essentially make it a counterpart to Burn, and would mean that special attackers have a lot more to deal with and think about. It would also help in the idea of Poison types being really long-lived, as now basically they can sit on special attackers. I think that one of the reasons why this might work is that Toxic recently had its distribution cut to mostly Poison type Pokemon, because when Toxic was extremely widely distributed, this would absolutely not have worked and been way too overpowered. The second option, and I think the one that maybe could be more interesting, is that it lowers a defense or special defense. Thematically, I think that this could work with Poison essentially lowering the tolerance and ability to resist pain of the Pokemon. I also feel as though it would really change how Poison types play, because now you poison a Pokemon and then suddenly they are weaker, and then you can start the offensive. Because I can't decide which defense it should really be with, maybe you can make it so that when a Pokemon is poisoned, they take extra damage. So it's just a flat modifier rather than having to be specific on one side. I think that this would really help with breaking down walls. It would make Poison a much better offensive utility to have. There is, however, one elephant in the room: Glamora. If either of these were to happen, I feel as though Glamora and Toxic Spikes would become invaluable and would become too powerful. So I think that they would really have to change how Toxic Spikes would work. Now, I feel as though Toxic Spikes should be used up whenever it poisons a Pokemon. So essentially, if you have Toxic Spikes up and a Pokemon comes in, they will then be used up once they have poisoned the Pokemon. This obviously doesn't happen for flying Pokemon or Pokemon with heavy duty boots, but it would happen to pretty much every other Pokemon. Because this is what used to happen with poison types, I'd like to see it that poison types actually get healed a little bit when they come in and absorb the spikes, because obviously they don't get poisoned. As well as this, I'd also like to see badly poisoning be changed. At the moment, it resets every time you switch out and goes back to stage 1. However, I think that every time you switch out, it should go back just a single stage. This way, it continues to apply continuous pressure throughout the game, which, as I mentioned before, is what I think the poison type should be about. A pretty small and minor change that I'd actually like to add to the poison type isn't really a direct buff to the poison type, it's more to black sludge. If you don't know, the item black sludge essentially works as a leftovers, but only for the poison type. If you aren't a poison type, it will deal 1/8 of your health in damage every single turn. The reason why you would want to use the black sludge is in case it got tricked away from you, just so that it would hurt your opponents rather than it just being another leftovers to give to them. However, in Generation 9 with terastallizing, the black sludge stopped being useful because if you change types, it would suddenly be a burden. This essentially meant that it was just a worse version of leftovers, and because it's so specific to just the poison type, I don't think that that should be the case. I feel as though buffing the amount of healing that black sludge does to you would be the only viable option. 1/8 of your health seems like a lot, especially considering that there's Pokemon like Toxapex, and that would just be hell. Maybe you could find somewhere in the middle like 1/12, just so that the black sludge actually has a bit of a use to it, and isn't just a leftovers clone that also has some drawbacks. So, what did you think to these changes to the poison type? Poison has always been one of my favourite types because it's such a unique way to play the game. Like I said before, not every type should be good, but I feel as though they should all be unique. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like or a subscribe. Thank you.